Well, I sense the passion in your argument, but I just wonder, would you have said that when you were serving as a young military officer in Northern Ireland in the late 60s and early 70s, when we know that the British military routinely used what has since been regarded as cruel and degrading treatment against suspected IRA prisoners?
Very tame compared to what waterboarding went on, but it was wrong.
But did you say that at the time?
I didn't know it was going on.
But it was systemic at the time.
I didn't know about that, and I don't think many people did. It was interesting that people were put in stress positions, they were hooded, and they did that. But quite honestly, in an ordinary infantry battalion, which I was as a very junior officer, I never came across that. And I served in various other parts of the world, in Aden, in Yemen, in Oman, in Malaysia. Now, I'm absolutely sure that sometimes people did the wrong thing. But I certainly never came across it
I just wonder whether you would acknowledge it's easier, perhaps now, retired, sitting in that chair, rather than being responsible for the nation's security, to take the position you do. Dick Cheney, for example, who's just left office, says, you know what, I make no apologies for what we did, for the enhanced interrogations, and he says it saved thousands, if not tens of thousands of lives.
Well, I would say it recruited tens of thousands of people onto the jihadist side, because they were so shocked about it. Do you know more people have committed suicide in Guantanamo than have been released?
So no question in your mind?
I think that there's absolutely no question in my mind that we are a country which must remind itself from time to time that there's a moral element to this. Anyway, we have a just war tradition, and we abandon that at our peril. Now, I'm quite realistic. But I know that from time to time people will do terrible things. But that doesn't mean that they should be tolerated by the President, the Prime Minister, by Dick Cheney, or the Chief of Defence Staff.
You say a just war. Is Afghanistan a just war today, and is it worth the cost that British soldiers are paying? 12 dying in May, the highest death toll for a year.
Well, is it a just war? I think it was absolutely just for us to destroy the Al-Qaeda camps, because they were training people and had already succeeded in training people to kill Americans and British people.
They're not really destroyed, are they? They've just gone to Pakistan.
Well, the Al-Qaeda is not as thing. But Pakistan, if you talk about Pakistan and Afghanistan, Pakistan is a far, far more important country, and it's probably the most dangerous country in the world now, because it's not really in control. Great parts of Pakistan are still failed states, and it is a nuclear power. And I worry about it because of the position of India. The suspicion between India and Pakistan is terrible. After the Mumbai attacks in November, if there had been another one, I think the Indians would have found it very difficult not to go to war with Pakistan.
But Lord Guthrie,
Pakistan has nuclear weapons.
As you tell me how dangerous the region is, I'm just wondering whether this is another example where the strategy pursued by the United States and its closest allies, like the United Kingdom, simply hasn't worked. We have tens of thousands of troops between us in Afghanistan.
Well, I think
Afghanistan is not secure. Pakistan's becoming less secure. Again, it seems we're not very good at counterinsurgency.
Well, I think that what we're not very good at is post-conflict resolution. What happens after the war, the unforeseen consequences. It seems to me that, as I say, going into Afghanistan was fair enough. But then, what was the plan? What was the plan after the Iraq War, the second Iraq War? There was no plan, really. And it is always, in my experience, conflict is horrible, it's dangerous, it's frightening. But it's a lot easier, usually, than what comes afterwards, which is much more expensive and goes on for far, far longer. So you want to think very carefully about unforeseen consequences and what do you do about it.
The point you make about expense is an interesting one, because what we have seen increasingly in the last couple of years is the Americans worrying that the British armed forces, both at the tail end of their Iraq operation in southern Iraq around Basra and also in Helmand province in Afghanistan, are simply not equipped and resourced to be effective when it comes to counterinsurgency.
Well, I think that a lot of Americans do think that too, and though a lot of senior ones say
they tell you,
it's the same as it ever was, I think a lot don't view us now as perhaps the staunch ally we were, and I think Basra had something to do with that.
And do you think there's some justice in that view?
I think there's a bit of justice in that.
Well, that must,
too.
as a former defence chief, worry you
It worries me
enormously.
very much, and I think that's one of the reasons why we need to have this defence review, which we talked about, to actually see what we can do. Now, I believe we can still be useful partners of the United States, we can be useful partners in Europe, but we have to make sure that we're spending our money in the right way. But there's no point going alongside a highly technical army if we can't actually keep up with it. And that's what we need to do.
If I may say so,
we cannot spend money on everything.
You probably would agree with me that you've been delivering that message for years. And indeed, when you were still Chief of the Defence Armed Forces, you had rows with Gordon Brown. He once said to you, "You don't think I know anything about defence," and you said, "I bloody well do think you don't."
Or
no.
words to that effect.
Words to that effect. So if you've been delivering this message to the man who was Chancellor and is now Prime Minister for so long, how come nothing has changed? And you told me at the beginning
well,
that
I
it's got
think
worse.
that I don't think he was naturally sympathetic about defence. I don't think he knew much about defence when he was the Chancellor. But actually, he is the Prime Minister of a country which was fighting 2 wars. Now, what has happened is that a lot of kit, a lot of equipment which the British Army and the Navy and the Air Force have is very good. But there are great gaps. For instance, we need more helicopters in Afghanistan. We need more support aircraft. We actually need more people in Afghanistan. We need to coordinate our efforts better.
Do we not have the wrong kit? I mean, we're still contemplating spending billions of pounds on new aircraft carriers, £20 billion at least, they say, on renewing the Trident nuclear weapons system. And those don't seem relevant to fighting the sort of war we face in Afghanistan or faced in Iraq. Are we just
well, I
buying the
think
wrong
we have
stuff?
to, when we have a defence review, we have to look at very carefully what's the most likely kind of wars we're going to be involved in. Is it going to be like the Cold War? I would say it's not going to be like the Cold War, but we are notoriously bad, everybody's bad at forecasting where the next crisis is. If when I was Chief of Defence Staff somebody told me I was going to be in Afghanistan, I'd have thought they'd gone off their heads all those years ago. So the trick is to balance your forces.
But, well, I understand that.
To balance your forces so you can react to the unseen. Now,
Is
we
it not
can't
safe to
afford,
say,
we
though,
can't
if I may,
afford,
is
no,
it
you
not
may
s-
not until I've
Well,
finished
all right,
talking.
then go on.
You cannot actually balance your forces as well as you would like to because you can't afford it. Therefore, you have to make very hard choices. What is the most likely thing you're having to do? Is it going to be a battle in the Atlantic? Is it going to be in the air? And you're going to have to design your forces like that.
And when I said if I may, it was an if I may to say the one scenario it's almost impossible to imagine, is it not, is that we in the United Kingdom would need and would use an independent nuclear deterrent. And to quote 3 generals who I'm sure you know very well, former Field Marshal Lord Bramall, former generals Lord Ramsbotham and Sir Hugh Beach, they all signed a letter saying nuclear weapons have shown themselves to be, quote, completely useless as a deterrent to the threats and the scale of violence that we currently face or are likely to face.
Well, I think that we all want to strive for a nuclear-free world. We really do.
But that's
for
a different
me,
point.
debate,
I'm just saying, given Britain's
the-
needs,
my
should we
de-
not
my
ditch?
my point, well, we need a nuclear-free world. And I believe that a nuclear weapon is actually a good bargaining chip. And if we give it up at times, if we give it up now, no one's going to notice it. Now, we may not be able to afford to do it, and that's what a defence review would look like. But I think that the kind of initiative which is happening in the United States is well worth our thinking about. We want to drive down nuclear weapons, and more countries getting them. I agree that it's inconceivable that we're going to use it at the moment, but it is a sort of final resource. And I believe it helps us. It's going to help us in the long term if we have them in order to argue the case. If we don't have them, we won't have a place to argue about it.
But you